Good evening. My name is Marty MacArthur, and I am president of the River City chapter of Wild Ones, and I would like to welcome you to our first virtual meeting. Wild Ones is a national organization based in Neenah, Wisconsin, and River City is one of 56 chapters with 4,000 members established throughout the United States. Our motto is healing the earth 1 yard at a time. We want to stay connected to you, our members, even though we cannot meet as a group. We want you to know that we are here working to support you with helpful information and resources as you bring native plants into your yards and gardens. Remember to follow us on Facebook. Marty MacCleery will now present birds, insects, native plants, and much more, inviting the web of life into your yard. I'm turning it over to you, Marty.
Great, thank you so much. Before we begin our program, I wanted to let you know that two members of Wild Ones, Amy Heileman and Rebecca Marquardt, will be assisting me this evening by answering your written questions during the program. At the end of the program, I'll do my best to answer any remaining questions. Thank you so much, Amy and Rebecca, for your help. And now just a little bit about myself. Although my work career was science-based, gardening has always satisfied both my love of science and the arts in equal measure. I'm active with young children at 4-H, a docent at Meyer Gardens and Sculpture Park, and chair of the education committee here at Wild Ones River City. I'm also an advanced master gardener and master naturalist through MSU Extension and a lifelong learner. Here are just a few ground rules before we get started. If you have any questions during the program, please type them in the chat window. To bring up the chat window, use the command bar on your screen with a button labeled chat or participants or more. And this could differ depending on what platform you have. Please be aware that any handouts, websites, or books mentioned during this presentation will be provided to you at the end of the program with a web link to those resources. So there's no need to write them all down since you'll receive all that information at the end. Now I'm going to turn off my video as we begin our program. Welcome to Birds, Insects, and Native Plants. Again, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat window. About a year ago, in April 2019, Doug Tallamy, a noted entomologist, was here in town. He electrified the audience at the Bluebird Conference at Calvin University with his presentations on the importance of native plants to the food web, particularly birds. Later, Wild Ones Unlimited invited our organization to give a talk to reinforce that message to both casual and earnest bird watchers who may not have been familiar with those connections. And the owner of Wild Birds Unlimited had been in the audience at the Bluebird Festival and wanted those important messages to get out to a wider audience. So today's presentation builds on that talk, but with even more info of interest. We hope you enjoy it. So let's get started. We know you're here because you love gardens, birds, probably parks, and nature too. And you probably help birds by putting out feeders with seed, berries, and suet, and also offering them some water. You love watching their antics, identifying them, and figuring out where they're traveling to and from. We know that's because you care about birds and you want to help them thrive. And we all want them to choose our yards for food, water, shelter, and a place to rear their young. But one element that is often overlooked when feeding birds is the plants that we choose for our yards. But you say, aren't the flowering trees and shrubs in my yard already providing berries to the wildlife? Isn't that enough? Well, that alone is not enough. Did you know that 96% of all our terrestrial birds in North America rely on insect protein to feed their young, not seeds or berries? Why? Because insects are loaded with fats, protein, and essential elements that give their chicks a huge boost. You could sort of think of it as formula for baby birds. Bird moms initially start out with caterpillars and moths since they're gentle on a baby chick's fragile throat and easily digested. Even a hummingbird's diet is 80 to 90% insects and spiders, supplemented with nectar from flowering plants and our hummingbird feeders. Studies have shown that a chickadee pair delivers around 400 to 600 caterpillars to the nest each day. So that means that chickadee parents catch a total of 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars over a 16-day duration to raise just one clutch of chicks. Okay, you say, so aren't there enough insects out there for the chickadees and larger birds to provide what they need for their young? Well, not so much, with landscapes looking more and more like this. Most landscapes in the US contain only 10% of what could be there in the way of productive plants, shrubs, or trees. What's more, the most productive plants and trees that should be there are not native plants and trees. So what is a native plant? Native plants are the plants that were living here in our part of the world, whether in West Michigan or another region, hundreds of thousands of years before any settlers or explorers from other continents arrived, such as Europe. For those of you who are new to native plants today, I'm showing you a wonderful full-page color brochure from MSU Extension. This bulletin can be obtained for free as a PDF from this MSU website. What I love about this publication is this 2-page insert featuring 26 flowering native plants with their photos and showing when they bloom during the growing season. It seems my parrot is enjoying this presentation too, so just ignore him. It's a wonderful guide to make sure you always have some native plants flowering for you and the insects from spring to fall. This chart was an inspiration to me when I was getting started, since I was just learning what native plants were and some of their names. Native plants are hardy plants that have learned to adapt to our region's best and worst weather conditions. And during that deep time, insects developed unique adaptations to the plants. 90% of all plant-eating insects co-evolved with certain plants to develop something called a host-plant specialist relationship. This means that those insects can only develop and reproduce on the plants with which they share this relationship. Over time, they develop the enzymes and physiological traits to digest their host plants, whether those plants be toxic, bitter, sticky, rough, or waxy. And they also develop the behavioral and the life history habits to flourish on them. But it took hundreds of thousands of years for that to happen. And native plants adapted over time by growing deep root systems to withstand whatever the weather threw at them over the years. Native plants may take a few years to get going while they establish their roots, but those deep roots yield big dividends in the future. Notice the lawn turf in the center of this graph. Most lawns are comprised of exotic species that can't live without consistent watering. Remember the Great Michigan Flood of 2013 when the Grand River overflowed its banks? Well, later that summer, we had a drought in Michigan. My native prairie plants were the only ones that stayed a vibrant green all summer. It's as if they were saying, "What drought?" After that, I got it. But we have a tradition in our society of using non-native or exotic ornamentals in our yards that provide neither food nor shelter for animals. In fact, going after the latest exotic plant is actually a custom that goes back to Victorian times, when we started bringing back unusual plants by ship from around the world. Sort of the old, "look what I've got and you don't." That tradition continues to this day in the commercial horticulture industry, with new hybrids and cultivars coming along all the time to catch our eye. And even our large lawns harken back to the days of the landed gentry in Great Britain, since land has long represented wealth in our cultural history. But our lawns are also monocultures of non-native species that require large amounts of water, fertilizer, and pesticides to maintain a uniform and perfect appearance, but for what purpose? For status. Again, look what I have, but I don't need or use. What we haven't quite understood is that exotic plant species are not the best choice for our native plant-eating insects. Since our insect herbivores did not co-evolve with these alien plants, they often do not even recognize them as food. But we should be forgiven for not fully appreciating that idea, since it took Doug Tallamy, a trained entomologist who studies insects and author of Bringing Nature Home, 20 years to come to that realization. But wait, if our exotic non-native ornamentals attract fewer insects, isn't that a gardener's dream? Well, it has been until recently, but views are changing on that. Now staring us in the face is the critical role that native insects play in our terrestrial ecosystem, upon which most of us animals depend. A land without insects is a land without most forms of higher life, including humans, E.O. Wilson said in 1987. A plant that doesn't feed anything is a waste of resources. We don't hear that very often, do we? For decades, we've tended to think of the plants in our living spaces as a collection of decorative objects that are just for our own viewing pleasure. Have we become so far removed from the important services that natural landscapes provide that we no longer appreciate what those services are anymore? Try this mind experiment. Try thinking of the natural landscape as a delicate community that arises between the living world, plants, animals, and microbes, and the non-living world, air, water, and mineral soil. There are many important benefits that arise from this delicate interaction between the living and the non-living world that are both small and large, direct and indirect, upon which all creatures depend, including us. And those beneficial goods and services are actually called ecosystem services that natural landscapes have provided for millennia. Water purification, we know, is carried out by plants and the soil filtering the water, and flood control by wetlands and plant roots preventing erosion. Climate regulation, plants clean air and retain and recycle water. And what would we do without the food production? Fruits, vegetables, trees, pollinators, fish, livestock, plant fibers for clothes, medicinal benefits, forestry products, fuel. And nutrient recycling. What would we do without the microbes that decompose the waste, and soil formation and fertility? There's habitat formation for wildlife and carbon storage in the trees, oceans, and permafrost. Pest and disease management with beneficial insects and birds. And recreation offers its aesthetic opportunities, of course. So the question is, in this 21st century, can we learn to share our living spaces with wildlife in a way that sustains life for all of us? The greatest opportunity for doing this lies in the suburbs, where about half of us currently live in the US. Dr. Doug Tallamy explains some of these findings in his landmark 2007 book, Bringing Nature Home. He's a noted entomologist from University of Delaware who was among the first to recognize some alarming trends in our modern landscapes. He shares many observations and insights that he's gathered over the years in this wonderful book. He also cited research available at the time to support his conclusions. Check YouTube for some amazing videos of lectures he's given all over the country. Although this book has a simple message that's easily grasped and understood, most serious gardeners have read it more than once and been inspired all over again by coming back to the basics. If you don't want to read a book, this 2-page article on our website is a terrific summary called Gardening for Life by Doug Tallamy. It's a must-read for anyone new to native plants. Tallamy has now come out with a new book, Nature's Best Hope, published in February 2020. This book follows up with even more facts and some original research by his graduate students at the University of Delaware that add to his insights from Bringing Nature Home, but with a new sense of urgency. He also presents each of us with a unique challenge that I'll be talking about in a minute. Ironically, new studies came out after he submitted his book for publishing, thus further adding to the sense of urgency. What wildlife need isn't much different from what we need: food, water, shelter, and a place to rear their young. A water source is so important for wildlife and insects, but this simple fact is often forgotten in many landscapes. However, when we use exotic or non-native plants in our landscapes, we're essentially waging war on our wildlife by removing their food supplies and homes. So they have to struggle to survive, hide, and reproduce. There aren't many contiguous large swaths of land left in North America for wildlife and wild plants today. Since our nation began, we've been expanding outward, taking up the forests, meadows, and wetlands with development, which has led to ever shrinking and chopped up habitats for wildlife. Most of our land now is urban, suburban, or agricultural, which can be harsh environments for wildlife. And our natural areas are no longer large enough to sustain life. Research has indicated that this sort of habitat fragmentation can lead to extinction, since there are limited opportunities for the wildlife to roam freely in search of food and mates. We know that all populations are subject to fluctuations up and down over time, but if you're already a small population in a small proscribed area, one bad year could snuff you out of existence. That's called local extinction. And we have 30% fewer breeding birds than just 50 years ago here in the US, according to a Cornell Lab of Ornithology study in 2019. That includes both beloved and common species of birds. Even the lead author, Ken Rosenberg, was astounded by their findings. Also in 2019 was a UN biodiversity study that predicted the unprecedented extinction of 1 million species worldwide due to ecosystem destruction if we do nothing in the next 20 years. By not intervening to stop this destruction, both locally and globally, we could witness the collapse of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide. Couple that with our widespread use of pesticides without regard to the collateral damage, our choice of non-native plants in our landscapes, and the introduction of invasive species that are displacing our natural habitats, we're at a crossroads. How can we learn to share our landscapes with native plants and the animals who need them? Does it always have to be winner takes all? No, it doesn't always have to be winner takes all. We need to give ourselves cultural permission to act in a transformative way because we all have a stake in this as citizens of the world. By including native plants in our yards, we are recreating a small portion of the natural ecosystem for our wildlife. And that's because native plants are the central cog of the wheel that forms the basis of a healthy wildlife habitat garden. Talamy suggests we raise the bar of what we expect our own landscapes to do. He encourages us to create biological corridors that connect wildlife where we work, live, and play. And we can do that by reducing areas of just turf grass into welcoming habitats that supply food, water, shelter, and nesting sites for wildlife. But we don't have to think about it as a indulge versus sacrifice. That's a false dichotomy because it's actually fun. And you'll be amazed at how your yard begins to harbor more life than you thought possible. You'll spend more time in your yard. You'll enjoy those moments of discovery and feel more connected to the web of life. And we would be doing our part to reduce the species drain from our local ecosystems by planting native plants. So here is Talamy's challenge to each one of us in his latest book, Nature's Best Hope. First of all, it's a known fact that we have devoted over 40 million acres of our country to lawn turf. That's an area the size of New England. What if we decided to replant just half of our landscapes now in lawn into areas with native plants? We could construct a 20 million acre homegrown national park that would nearly equal the size of all the national parks combined in the lower 48 states. Notice that we're not moving out to make room for this park. No, we're simply re-landscaping half of our individual yards. And by so doing, we would become part of the larger tapestry of biodiverse corridors connecting wildlife where we work, live, and play to the benefit of us all. We are nature's best hope. And this is a bottom-up movement that we can all participate in, whether we have a yard or not, by becoming environmental stewards in our own community, whether it's our roadsides, parks, or urban areas. And I think that Keith Edwards is leading the way right in our own community. This spring, I'm inspired to install small groves of native trees, native shrubs, and plants in my front yard to serve as little oases of biodiversity for my birds and wildlife. I'm sure I'll learn a lot, probably make mistakes, but I learn best from real life experiences. I already have a woodland native garden in the back, but now it's time to modify my front yard in ever more meaningful ways to show others that there are alternative ways to landscape our living spaces. Most of our front yards are so-called food deserts for habitat wildlife. Anyway, this is something I would not have attempted 10 years ago. I would never recommend going from 0 native plants to 100% native plants right away. You need time to get accustomed to their characteristics and requirements, and that doesn't happen overnight. The old adage to plant the right plant in the right place is as true for native plants as any other plant. Looking for a good excuse to delay mowing your lawn for the first time in the spring? Help those early foraging bumblebees by giving them a chance to visit your blooming dandelions, violets, and clover, which are an excellent source of early nectar. And when you do mow, keep your mower height around 3 to 4 inches. Why? So the flowering plants can continue to flower, as well as protecting your lawn from sun scorch by keeping the grass blades a little longer. Bees may disagree with you about what is a weed and what is a flower. Bees judge a plant by its nectar. Did you know that it's good practice to avoid spraying your yard when turf flowers are in bloom? Pesticides can actually concentrate in the nectar and pollen and harm visiting insects and their young, according to the Xerces Society. Speaking of the Xerces Society, here's their authoritative guide to attracting native pollinators. It's loaded with interesting pictures and information, and also guides you to ideas for educators and parents, and a wealth of more resources in the appendix. Plants are the fundamental source of the sun's energy for all terrestrial creatures. To be specific, plant-feeding insects are the link that pass on solar energy from plants to much of the rest of animal life on Earth. That solar energy resides in the plants as the carbon bonds of carbohydrates and simple sugars as a product of photosynthesis. So if the plant-feeding insects are not interacting with the plants in our landscape, that solar energy cannot transfer to the rest of the food web, or to the insects and spiders and animals that eat the insects, or to the animals that eat the animals that ate the insects. That includes birds and us, and so on. A drop in insects from a lack of native plants at the base of the food web could result in a catastrophic drop in biomass of higher organisms in the food web. Here's a little tip that will help make your yard transformation a little easier. Would it surprise you to learn that just 5% of the available plant genera support nearly 75% of the availability of caterpillar species, so are essential to your yard? Oaks, willows, cherries, hickory, pines, sycamore, basswood, dogwoods, viburnums. In fact, native oaks, willows, and cherries alone are the 3 top larval hosts that serve 1,400 species of insects. And they also provide fruits and protein-rich nuts to a hungry food web. And this is just a partial listing of the table in Talamy's Bringing Nature Home, Chapter 12, page 147. So basically, the message is simple. A variety of native plants equals a variety of insects equals food for the rest of the food web. And so what we're really talking about is biodiversity. Biodiversity is actually our insurance policy to assure productive, stable, and resilient ecosystems that can combat external assaults, such as pests, diseases, and even climate change. Do our yards have to be 100% native plants? Not necessarily. I still love my rhododendrons, daylilies, and hostas. But Ptolemy says that we can have up to 30% non-native varieties and still enjoy the ecological benefits of a native plant landscape. But what is really important is that we learn to critically appreciate what each plant in our landscape contributes to our habitat. And we should also be mindful of any new plants that we place in our yard, making sure that they are contributors and not just taking up space. Well, how would we know if we've been successful? When you observe signs that your ecosystem is starting to work again, such as bird couples choosing your yard to raise their young. When you have breeding birds in your yard, there are insect larvae nearby that are keeping their young alive. And you notice more butterflies, moths, spiders, and dragonflies. You notice holes in some of the leaves of your native plants. Yes, that's a success. You see lightning bugs after you started leaving more leaf litter undisturbed in your garden beds. And you see an occasional garter snake. These are all tangible signs that you have a functioning ecosystem in your yard, and that should delight you and the wildlife. There's a remarkable organization called Saving Plants Through Habitat, helping to improve habitat for migrating birds one backyard at a time. One backyard at a time. I love that. It's located in Leelanau County in Michigan and features a 44-acre sanctuary. Its mission is closely aligned with Wild Ones, with an emphasis on addressing the serious decline of migrating birds in North and South America. They promote many of the solutions that we're talking about this evening, including the Grow a Bird Feeder initiative that offers a beginner's guide to native plants that can be downloaded. They have a lovely poster that explains how insects are crucial to migrating and nesting birds. Only native plants support insect biomass. You can grow a bird feeder by planting native trees, shrubs, flowers, and grasses. Check out our 2020 Michigan native plant vendors listing on our website to find local sources to purchase native plants. Wild Ones does not promote any particular business. On the native plant vendor list are several local plant sales that may be of interest to you, including the Kent Conservation District plant sales on May 2nd and May 23rd. These are pre-order and prepay only, with the day of the sale being pickup by time slot with no mingling. Check their website for a list of plants, shrubs, and trees. Calvin University's plant sale on May 2nd has been postponed due to COVID-19. Check their website for any updates to the new date and list of plants. And Wild Ones River City plant sale and fundraiser is on July 20th if all goes as planned. Please check our website for any updates. You know, Wild Ones isn't just about the plants. It's also about the friendships and a sense of purpose forged with our peeps. Some of those native plant vendors are also members of the Native Plant Guild, a network of West Michigan landscape professionals who provide these services: design, installation, maintenance, and production of Michigan native plants and their use in the landscape. This is their new marketing card showing their website and guild members. Again, Wild Ones doesn't promote any particular business. Looking for a listing to help you search for a spot in your yard that will meet the lighting needs of the native plants you just purchased? This is your handout. Refer to our native shrubs listing if you would like to create an understory or just have some larger native plant specimens in your yard. The American mountain ash is a popular decorative tree, especially amongst wildlife watchers who use its fruits to attract wintering birds. Its moderate height, usually topping out at about 40 feet, means that the mountain ash isn't too much of a problem for power lines, and it's tolerant of strong winds, clay soils, and variable pH. Mountain ash berries are not eaten fresh. They're very bitter and high in tannin. They don't taste very good, but birds do eat them. And they have brilliant red-orange berries that attract lots of birds, especially cedar waxwings. And the fruits that have begun to ferment on the tree can have an intoxicating effect on the nature. The most commonly planted mountain ash is the European mountain ash. Sorbus acuparia. However, it is more susceptible to fire blight, a destructive bacterium of pome fruit trees such as apples and pears. So be sure to obtain an American mountain ash, which is hardier and more beneficial for wildlife in the region. Although wild plums are not a choice food for wildlife, the plants do provide valuable nesting cover and are a host to many butterflies. Deer do eat the buds and leaves, and voles eat the bark in the winter, so protect them with tubes or fences. It's a clone-forming, gnarly understory tree that sends out prolific suckers and can have thorny lateral branches. So use it on the garden edge as a hedgerow screen or a specimen plant. All parts of the tree contain hydrocyanic acid, except the flesh and skin of the plums. The wild black cherry is a moderately long-lived tree that loves sunlight, and it supports a wide variety of native butterflies and moths, and the berries provide food for birds and small mammals in late summer. Although this plant is highly ornamental, it's probably more suitable for naturalizing. Why? Because it can be susceptible to a fungus called black knot disease, resulting in large black growths along the twigs and small branches that can result in some dieback. Cut out and destroy the infected branches, going back about 4 inches below the knot. But if you have a wild black cherry, it's worth preserving because of its use to wildlife. It's a handsome shade or specimen tree. Did you know that people have been growing Bradford pears since the 1960s? Scientists from the U.S. Agricultural Department promoted the virtues of this tree, which became immensely popular and in time was seen growing across the nation. However, this tree from Asia adapted so well here that many escaped from cultivation and became invasive, eventually outcompeting our native species. Birds eat the berries, and then the plants would spread to form impenetrable thickets with 3-inch thorns and reduced biodiversity. The irony is that this wild Pyrus calleriana is not invasive or even particularly common in China. But we played around with it genetically to meet our needs, and now it's even marching through our natural areas. So rather than a Bradford pear, consider trying a serviceberry, which is comprised of 33 species with just 3 species found in Europe and Asia. The genus has more than 800 common names and are sometimes confusing to identify since they're known to hybridize. They range from shrubs to small understory trees, and they have smooth grayish bark when young and provide year-round interest, including fall foliage color. Serviceberries bloom in March and early April with white petals and pink anthers, and the berries are delicious and taste like blueberries, so no wonder the cedar waxwings love them. Serviceberry is steeped in American folklore since pioneers knew that this plant blooming meant the end of winter. So delayed weddings could commence as well as funerals, since the ground could be dug for burying their loved ones who had died during the winter. Or you could try a flowering dogwood that can reach 30 feet in height, but averages about 15 feet tall in our landscaping spaces. It is most notable for its early spring flowers, white or sometimes pink, that bloom for 2 to 3 weeks. The blooms are a bract type or modified leaf on the outside with a small yellow flower cluster in the center. Wildlife benefit from the flowering dogwood. The fruit is choice fall and winter food for many birds. The leaves and twigs are a good choice of food for the white-tailed deer. It is not an important nesting plant. It's an ornamental tree used around homes and office buildings because of its striking display when it's in full bloom. Flowering dogwood is adapted to most upland sites, but it grows best on rich, well-drained soils on middle and lower slopes. It develops best as an understory species in association with other hardwoods. It can be subject to borers and anthracnose, a ubiquitous fungal infection that includes powdery mildew and apple scab. We've all grown up knowing about the winged burning bush, Euonymus elatus, that turns a bright red in fall. It was introduced to the US around 1860 as an ornamental from Asia and Eastern Russia. But over time, it escaped cultivation and is now considered to be a noxious weed in 21 Eastern and Midwestern states. So a better choice would be this native burning bush, Euonymus atropurpureus, also known as the Eastern wahoo, that is much better behaved. It shares many of the same characteristics, including stems with corky ridges, turns a lovely color in the fall, and nourishes the birds with berries. And it has not shown any of the invasive traits of its Asian counterpart. Although jack pine can grow up to 60 feet tall, it generally grows around 20 or 40 feet in most of our landscape conditions. It grows faster during its first 20 years or so, and it has a stark open habit, making it good for windbreaks and screening. The cones are strongly curved and brown when ripe, then turn gray. The hard resinous cones, known as fire cones, open only after exposure to fire. Michigan's endangered Kirtland's warbler depends on young jack pines after forest fires for nesting. The white pine is a native species, the state tree of Michigan, and is tall and straight-stemmed. It has 5 needles per cluster that are long and soft, and deer will browse the needles during winter when food is scarce, and it's also used for timber. White pine provides good nesting and winter cover for birds, including wild turkey and mammals. But our beloved state tree has been under attack by the white pine weevil, as well as white pine bark beetles and others. Nick Sanchez, a forester with the Land Conservancy of West Michigan, explains that the pine weevil lays its eggs inside the terminal leader of white pine trees that are grown out in the open sun. Then the damaged leader causes 2 branches to compete for the sun. That leads to forking, structural failure, and die-off as time goes on. Have you ever seen an older white pine snapped off about 4 feet above the trunk? That's due to pine weevil, white pine weevil. They prefer nice sunny spots on the tree, so Nick recommends that you plant your tree in the partial shade of other trees to minimize damage by the weevil. Other options include disposing of the damaged leader that may contain the eggs. Then select a lateral branch by pruning to encourage it to be the new leader. Shellbark hickories can live for 150 to 200 years and has a single straight trunk, often branch-free on the bottom half. This tree has distinctive large compound leaves with characteristic orange twigs. Its bark is similar to shagbark hickory. The thick-shelled, oversized green fruit is edible and eaten by wildlife. Black chokeberry is a small shrub that has dark green, glossy summer foliage that turns a beautiful red in fall. The white flowers in spring transform into small black fruits that resemble tiny apples. The fruits are extremely tart and bitter, thus the name chokeberry. Black chokeberry does best if it's left untrimmed. However, control of the plant's expansion by removing suckers as they appear. American hazelnut has long been valued as an ornamental and for screening or naturalized settings. It grows in sun or partial shade and is useful for borders because of its clonal tendency. The leaves turn orange to red or purple and even yellow in the fall. This multi-stemmed rounded shrub occurs in moist to dry woods and thickets, forest margins, roadsides, and fence rows and other disturbed areas. It grows best on rich, moist, well-drained soil, but often may be found close to stream sides and also on prairies. This versatile shrub has a coarse habit and small but interesting dangling catkins in spring, followed by edible nuts in the fall, loved by squirrels and people too. American hazelnut benefits from regular pruning and removal of the suckers at its base. Consider trying a native arrowwood whose foliage turns into a lovely orangey red in fall. The dense foliage, white flower clusters, and dark blue berries make arrowwood viburnum an attractive shrub for landscaping. They can be used for borders or screens, or as mass plantings and groupings to attract birds, which eat the fruit. These are some of my favorite shrubs and trees in my yard. All parts of the spice bush have a pleasant smell. In fact, the species name benzoin means aromatic gum in Arabic. It has a nice branching habit that requires little to no pruning, and the caterpillar of the spice bush swallowtail dines on its leaves. I have a 4 to 5 year old yellow birch grown from a seedling. The trunk, it actually has 2 little trunks now. They're about 2 inches in diameter, and the bark is beginning to take on the appearance in the photo. It literally glows in the low afternoon sunlight. I'm growing a fragrant sumac near my front door. I'm hoping that my cement steps and the garage will limit its suckers so I can enjoy its berries and fall foliage. Bearberry is classified as a shrub, but I think of it more like an attractive ground cover that reaches up to 8 inches with leaves that resemble a cranberry plant. Bearberry is not the same plant as barberry. Speaking of Japanese barberry, you might want to consider some native alternatives to this, such as this fast-growing mounding shrub that provides white or pink blossoms in June, beautiful leaf colors, and has coppery exfoliating bark, thus its genus name, ninebark. It has showy seed capsules, fall foliage, and is hardy. Both native and honeybees seek out its nectar, and it provides shelter for wildlife. This shrub is in the rose family, so it can be subject to powdery mildew. So provide a nice open area where breezes can dry off this plant after a rain. Consider growing your own bird feeder by growing one of these native plants, such as coneflowers. Coneflowers are beautiful, and its blossoms have good staying power into late summer. The seed heads are an excellent source of winter food for birds. You know, it's a shame that many of our common names for our native plants have the word weed in them, such as milkweed and butterfly weed, which seems to diminish their true value in our mind. Common milkweed used to be everywhere along the roadside, but not so much now with current agricultural practices. And the larval stage of the monarch butterfly cannot exist without milkweed. Did you know we have over a half dozen milkweeds that are native to Michigan? The common milkweed, butterfly weed, swamp, prairie, world, poke, purple, and green. The silphium species are related to sunflowers and asters and are practically indestructible once established. Give them lots of room. A cup plant. Look how the leaves connect at the stem, forming a cup, adored by insects, birds, and small frogs because they do actually trap water. And the compass plant gets its name because its leaves tend to lie in a plane, usually in a north-south orientation. And I'd like to grow a Michigan lily, but I haven't succeeded yet. The cardinal flower has the deepest, purest red color I've ever seen. Both of these plants are in the Lobelia genus, and they like rich, moist soils. However, blue lobelia is a little more drought tolerant than cardinal flower. And most mammalian herbivores, deer, avoid these plants because they contain toxic alkaloids. And here are some more native plants to grab your attention. I love their names. Rattlesnake master loves full sun and is very architectural in its habits. Your neighbors will want to know what it is. And prairie smoke is also a showstopper, even though it's small and low to the ground. It blooms late into the summer. Instead of reaching for a yellow mum, give this native alternative a try for a late season bloomer, goldenrod. Your late season pollinators that are preparing for the end of the season will be very appreciative. Showy goldenrod is one of the most beautiful of all. And stiff goldenrod leaves turn into an attractive dusty rose in fall. Zigzag goldenrod actually has a delicate appearance in the woodland settings. Did you know that goldenrod does not cause allergy? But ragweed does. They blossom around the same time in the fall, which is why goldenrod has gotten a bad rap. There are 25 species of goldenrod in Michigan and 125 species nationwide. But most important of all is that 110 species of caterpillars feed on goldenrod, according to Ptolemy. New Jersey tea is a wonderful, moderately sized shrub that is beloved by bee pollinators. Its dried leaves have the scent of wintergreen. Maybe that's why it was used during the American Revolutionary War as a tea substitute without caffeine to scorn King George's tea tax. More wonderful natives. Golden Alexander is amazingly adaptable and succeeds in sun or shade, and pollinators get in a frenzy over blazing star. I've often wondered why the maroon blossoms of the ginger plant are so subtle and lay hidden below the foliage. Well, those blossoms are not for my enjoyment. The ants are interested in the seeds, which have little fleshy growths on them called elaiosomes that are rich in lipids and proteins that they feed to their larvae. And after the young have eaten the fleshy growths off of the seeds, the ants transport the seeds to a waste disposal dump that is rich in nutrients from ant frass and dead insect bodies. And there the seeds germinate very nicely, thank you very much. Yes, this is an example of symbiosis called dispersive mutualism. Since research has revealed that many species of ants are interested in these elaiosomes, at least 11,000, possibly up to 23,000 species of ants, it's now recognized to be an example of convergent evolution in flowering plants. Who knew? But would it surprise you to learn that many other favorite natives share this same relationship with ants? Such as blue cohosh, bloodroot, Dutchman's breeches, trillium, golden seal, and Jeffersonia twinleaf, among others. So much to discover, so little time. A great choice of grass for your native landscape is prairie dropseed. Native to most of eastern North America, this species really hits its stride in the Midwestern prairies since it excels in hot, dry conditions and really soaks up the sun. It responds well to fire. The seeds of this species, which drop in the fall, smell like cilantro and are a great food source for seed-eating birds. It has a wonderful tussock-forming growth habit and takes on a nice golden hue throughout fall and winter. Sadly, in many areas of its range, prairie dropseed populations are in decline. Adding this species to your landscape is a great way to lend a helping hand in the persistence of prairie dropseed well into the future, along with bringing a different element to your native landscape. Here are some other good choices for native grasses. Some advantages of native grasses are that they provide good support for nearby long-stemmed native plants, and deer tend to not browse them. Cordgrass, either freshwater or prairie, can be used alone in formal locations when surrounded by mowed lawn or concrete. It's very rigid and upright with tough leaves, and it grows 5 to 7 feet, loves full sun with average to moist conditions, and blooms during August and September. It spreads aggressively and is great for erosion control and birds. The leaves have an attractive yellow color in the fall. By the way, try to avoid double-flowered or triple-flowered blossoms. They may be beautiful to us, but the reality is they often have less nectar, pollen, and seed than single-flowered plants. What's more, insects are often not even able to penetrate the flowers to get to the nectar. Which reminds me, as we near the end of the program, I need to raise an issue with you, although it could be a lecture in itself. The question is, does a nativar, which is a cultivated variety of a native plant, provide the same resources for pollinators as its wild cousin? The answer is, we don't know. It's too soon yet to answer that, but scientists and gardeners are looking for answers. Consider this. Nativars can be different from their native parents in various ways. The flower color and the scent, or the shape or number of the flowers and petals, as well as foliage color and more. This is important because plants are at the base of the food web, so they can affect other parts of the ecosystem. How do you know whether you're even buying a cultivated variety of a native plant? The plant tag may resemble something like this: Echinacea purpurea, white swan. The first two names, Echinacea purpurea, are the genus and species name for purple coneflower. White swan, in single quotes, indicates that it's a cultivar of a purple coneflower. But the important thing is, since color, scent, timing, and the size of the flowers are very important to pollinators, it is easy to imagine that nativars might be more or even less attractive to pollinators than the wild native species. They may even attract a different group of pollinators altogether. There are many citizen science groups out there who need you to share your observations with them on this topic, including budburst.org and many more. Just search for Citizen Science Organizations Native Plant versus Nativar. Plant native plants as if lives depend on it, because indeed it does. Doug Ptolemy says that landscapes need to be more than just pretty. By planting productive landscapes, we can create and nurture life. We are all responsible to nurture as much life in our outdoor surroundings as possible to maintain a stable and functioning ecosystem. Doug Ptolemy says that you don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you do have to save it where you live. This sign would certify that your yard is growing bird feeders by the Saving Birds Through Habitat organization. If you plant them, they will come, and you'll be contributing to the web of life right in your own yard. Put up a sign explaining what you're up to. Talk to your friends and neighbors. Be part of the movement to replace traditional landscapes with natural landscapes, healing the earth one yard at a time. Be sure to buy your native plants from a native plant grower. Tell your big box stores about selling native plants. This is a bottom-up movement. As we near the close, the Wild Ones Education Committee would like to share some of their favorite resources with you. This is one of Chris Muldoon's favorite, Michigan Flora Online. It basically builds on the field manual of Michigan Flora that has been published several times that you'll see at the right on the slide. However, Michigan Flora Online is a searchable, browsable, evolving, illustrated companion to the field manual of Michigan Flora. It is regularly updated with new information, new discoveries, and confirmed specimens. And it includes map distributions throughout Michigan and spore-bearing vascular plants. Here's another favorite of Chris's, the Midwest Native Garden, Native Alternatives to Non-Native Flowers and Plants. It takes you on a journey through all 4 seasons, describing the plants, native versus non-native, and the animal visitors, birds, insects, and small animals. It has beautiful hand-drawn illustrations and color photos. Here is one of Nancy Bedell's favorite books. Nancy was past chair of the Wild Ones Education Committee for many years, and we appreciate her. Landscaping with Native Plants of Michigan, an essential guide to successful native plant gardening in Michigan. I have to say, the thing I like the most about this book is the second half, which is comprised of handy one-page native plant profiles, so you can decide whether to select a particular native plant for your yard's conditions. And it has lovely color photos. And to prove to you how much I love this book, my copy is dog-eared, marked up, and mildewed, since it's been with me in the yard in all kinds of weather. One of Barb Olson's favorite is this one, Wildflowers of Michigan Field Guide. The book is actually organized by blossom color in the upper right-hand corner of all the pages. And then within those colors, they're sorted alphabetically by plant. A big advantage of this book is it's much easier to use than so-called dichotomous keys, especially if the plant is still in bloom. It has good use of icons for flower and cluster types, leaf type, attachment, and fruit, and the photos are really quite lovely. Now, this is one of Denise Kuykendall's favorite field guides, Wild Berries and Fruits of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Michigan Field Guide. It's a great way to learn what's edible and what to avoid with this easy-to-use field guide. It contains fruit-bearing trees and shrubs of the Midwest, some of which are not even in some of the tree books. It's organized by fruit color and then by form. It has interesting tidbits about the plant's many uses. It contains range maps, ripening calendar, and more. Did you know that in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, we have nearly 200 wild berries and fruits? And here's another useful resource put out by the National Wildlife Federation. And there's even a little endorsement on the book cover by Doug Tallamy. It's easy to read. It's a soft cover book that gives you all the tools you need to get started. These were the good old days when we could gather freely. I miss those days. Don't you? Different news headlines have indicated that gardeners are probably the happiest people during these shelter-in-place times, but I personally think that gardeners are their most happy when they can share their successes, challenges, and knowledge with other gardeners in person. I look forward to those days, and I wish you and your families the best of health until those days return. We hope you've enjoyed this program on the importance of native plants to the insects who need them, including birds and the rest of the food web. We also hope we inspired you to make some changes in your own yard. I'd also like to remind you that any resources or websites mentioned during this presentation will be provided to you as a master list of links. So we just have a few minutes left till 7:30. And we'd like to answer any more questions that you may have that were not answered during the presentation. Amy and Rebecca, do we have any questions?
We had a question about a good replacement plant for Bradford pear trees.
Mm-hmm.
And the response was that serviceberry would be a good alternative, hawthorn, and Amy provided a couple others in her response, and that would be redbud trees, black gum,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is a little bit bigger, or even a bur oak tree.
A what tree?
A bur oak.
Oh, bur oak, yes. Oh, yes. Redbud. Oh, I love redbud.
Redbud tree is also a authorized tree for the city of Grand Rapids. They have a urban tree list that they plant from, and there are several native species on that list.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
Redbud is one of them. Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. That's what I'd like to see more of. Native trees showing up on the lists that cities use.
Another question, Marty, we had was trying to have a little bit more distinction between how can you tell the difference between the shagbark hickory and the shellbark hickory. And Amy mentioned that you'll find the shellbark more in the lower floodplain areas.
Oh.
And I mentioned that another feature you can see is that the shellbark is not quite as shaggy bark as the shagbark hickory.
Thank you.
I'm seeing a question about deer browsing on native shrubs in the woods. Recommendations I have based on what I've seen myself. They're not technically shrubs, but they're herbaceous plants that almost look like shrubs, and those are the baneberries. There's a white baneberry and a red baneberry, and a cousin called spikenard. They
Mm.
die back to the ground at the end of the year, but they grow quickly during the summer, and they produce berries and spring flowers, and I have not seen the deer touch those.
I put mine behind little cages because I've had a little bit of browsing. But aren't the berries poisonous to wildlife?
They can
I'm
be
not
poisonous
sure.
to human. They can be poisonous
Humans?
to humans if eaten, if they eat too many, but not to wildlife.
Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, those are beautiful plants, baneberry.
Spice bush is another that grows in the shade, and that's a small scale tree with beautiful yellow blooms in the spring.
Mm-hmm. Mine are just starting to leaf out a little bit.
The spice bush look really beautiful at Amon Park right now.
Oh, really?
In their peak, yeah, all along the Sam
Oh.
Creek there. The spice bush are
Mhm.
there, and then another good place is Pickerel Lake. There's one that I've seen to see a good example of a spice bush tree.
Oh, great. I need to get over there, Amon Park and Pickerel Lake. They're really special places.
Hager Park in Ottawa County is also a wonderful county park that has colonies of spring wildflowers and some flowering shrubs as well.
Mm. And they have really old red buds too, don't they? They're
They do.
beautiful. I just never knew they could get that large, and they're just laden with blossoms when they're fully in bloom. Well, it's getting to be a little past 7:30, so I think maybe what we'll do is thank you all for your questions, and thank you, Amy and Rebecca, for helping us out with them. And now, in conclusion, I'd like to turn it over to Marty MacArthur.
Marty, do you have, there we go. I would just like to thank all of you for attending our webinar tonight, and I especially like to thank Marty MacCleery for the wonderful, informative program she has presented to us. We are grateful for your attendance and for your interest in native plants.